Democratic lawmakers in the US are considering changes that could benefit millions of undocumented immigrants. It's a shift from the Trump administration, which had been building a wall to keep out people the former president described as rapists and murderers. President Joe Biden says he wants to take a more humane approach, and it's resulted in a flood of migrants trying to cross the border. As Paolo Montecillo reports, it sparked fierce Republican opposition to any major reforms.
Febe Carrillo Ramos shows off what she believes is a ticket to a better future. The U.S. Customs and Border Patrol permit gives the Guatemalan safe passage to Houston, Texas. There, she and her 3-year-old son can reunite with her husband, who also fled a hostile homeland.
A lot of crime. A lot of people are involved in worldwide drug trafficking. You don't want to mess with those people. You better run away.
President Joe Biden's government has welcomed a limited number of asylum seekers. The previous administration had forced migrants to wait in Mexico while their applications were being processed.
We are all focused on improving the situation, on changing to a more humane and efficient system.
Democratic lawmakers are looking to pass more sweeping changes. This week, the House of Representatives is expected to vote on a proposal to create a path to citizenship for 2.5 million Dreamers. They are the people illegally brought into the U.S. as children by their parents. Lawmakers will also vote on a bill to grant legal status to farm workers. Criticism of the proposals is mounting, though. The country is seeing a surge in migrants at the Mexican border, and Republicans blame the president.
Even the president of Mexico. He said that people coming to the border see Biden as the migrant president, the encouragement of making it happen. I couldn't agree more.
Last month, almost 100,000 migrants were stopped at the U.S.-Mexico border, and more than 9,500 unaccompanied migrant children were held in detention centers.
What do you do with an unaccompanied child that comes to the border? Do you repeat what Trump did? You take them from their mothers, to move them away, hold them in cells, etc.? We're not doing that.
The children are hoping to either join relatives already in the U.S. or be sent to foster homes willing to take them in. As they wait, other would-be migrants will be watching as policymakers in Washington decide on who gets to have their American dream. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Our correspondent Kilmeny Duchardt has been following the situation at the US-Mexico border in Penitas, Texas, and sent us this report.
We're here in Penitas in South Texas, right along the US-Mexico border. This is one of the many points where we have seen a lot of migrants crossing illegally. A group of around 80 just arrived. Some of them have already been bused to Customs and Border Patrol facilities. A group of around 30 is waiting for another bus to come pick them up. The problem with the system right now is Health and Human Services facilities have been overcrowded with the number of migrants that have been crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. That has created a backlog from Customs and Border Patrol, which are only supposed to hold these migrants for around 72 hours. HHS has a capacity of 13,000. We're hearing reports that those facilities are maxed out. A lot of migrants have been sent to tent facilities. HHS is saying they need around 20,000 beds. That is just not enough. There are reports of poor condition in these facilities, a lot of migrants not getting the food that they need. It's really taxing the system, not just here on the U.S. side, but also on the Mexican side, where the Mexican government has concerns that the number of people crossing illegally is fueling the trafficking business and putting money into the pockets of cartels, which charge anywhere from $1,500 to $7,000 per migrant when they cross over into the United States. But this is something that, of course, the Biden administration is looking at. How do they accommodate the dire humanitarian situation from a lot of these migrants coming from Central American countries? House Democrats are working on 2 pieces of legislation, one that's going to try to provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented migrants that came to the United States as children, otherwise known as DACA recipients or the Dreamers, and the other would be agricultural workers, giving them a temporary status to a permanent one.
Well, for more, let's go to Sarah Pierce in Washington. She's a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome to the program, Sarah. Now, the US Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas says the country is facing the biggest surge of migrants in 20 years. Republicans say that what we're seeing now is a result of President Joe Biden unwinding some of Donald Trump's controversial and tough immigration measures. Do you agree? Is there truth to what the Republicans are saying?
I think there is some truth, yes. There's a lot going on that's driving migration to the southern border. There are long-standing problems in the Central American countries, including corruption, gang, domestic violence, economic troubles that are pushing that migration, in addition to more recent problems related to the pandemic and the recent hurricanes that the country suffered. But yes, after the very restrictive regime of Donald Trump, I think anyone who took office after him would bring a message of more hope on migration that might inspire more people to travel to the southern border. And I certainly think that's at play here.
Now, one of the policies that Joe Biden unwound back in January was the so-called Remain in Mexico policy that essentially forced asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while they were waiting for their cases to be heard in the United States. So now that that policy is no more, applicants technically can live and work in the US while they wait for a court hearing. Do you think this might inadvertently act as a green light for some migrants to actually attempt to make the journey and further fuel this crisis that we're seeing at the border?
Sure. The fact that President Biden has unwound some of President Trump's very restrictive southern border policies certainly would encourage migrants who are interested to coming to the southern border anyway. But it's really important to remember that President Biden has actually kept in place the most restrictive policy put into place under President Trump. That is an order coming from the director of the CDC. It's a public health order that mandates the expulsion of all unauthorized arrivals from the southern border, including asylum seekers. So the vast majority of asylum seekers arriving at the U.S. southern border are still being expelled. They're not being permitted to enter the country and apply for asylum. President Biden did make the decision to exempt unaccompanied children from that order, so they are being accepted, and that's the population that's really testing U.S. facilities right now. But the vast majority of asylum seekers are still being rejected. But that doesn't mean that the message isn't being confused south of the border, especially when you have this very strong smuggling industry that's interested in advertising that the border is open, whether or not it actually is.
Can I ask you more about that unaccompanied minor exemption? US Border Patrol officials say they've encountered more than 15,000 children travelling alone in January and February alone. And as we heard from Kilmeny's report, that's leading to what could be a humanitarian crisis in the United States itself as facilities struggle to properly house these unaccompanied children. What needs to be done in order to address this issue?
So the department within the U.S. government, the Department of Health and Human Services that's responsible for housing these children, needs to be doing two things. They need to be expanding their bed space, which is what they're doing, but they also need to bring beds back online that were taken offline because of the pandemic. Up until the beginning of March, HHS had actually taken offline 40% of their beds. So they were limited more to 7,000 beds rather than the 13,000 beds that Kilmeny referenced. So now they are in the process of bringing those beds back online. And once they do, they'll have better capacity to move the children out of insufficient Border Patrol conditions more quickly. But until that's done, unfortunately, there's a lot of backup in these Border Patrol facilities. And that is really unfortunate because they are just not sufficient at all to hold children.
Now, as we heard in Paolo's story, attention to this crisis is coming at a time when the US Congress is about to hear two bills related to this very issue. One will give a pathway to citizenship to the millions of undocumented migrants currently in the United States. Do you think that these scenes at the border and the border crisis that we're seeing right now, might that threaten the passage of these bills that really Democrats have been calling for years?
Yes, absolutely. So these, as you said, it's an issue that Congress has been struggling with for actually 2 decades now, granting a pathway to legal status for the large number of unauthorized children in the United States, or rather unauthorized people who came to the United States as children. We're talking about millions of individuals. And I think there are a lot of Republicans that are also on board with this legislation, but those that are against it will likely use this crisis as a reason to be against it. They'll point to the crisis and say, see, passing legislation that grants authorization to people who came as children is only going to invite future flows, when in reality, the legislation that's being considered before Congress will not benefit the unauthorized children who are arriving today. It's focused on people who have already been in the United States.
Okay, Sarah Pearce, we will have to leave it there, but thank you so much again for joining us on the program to shed some more light on this very pressing issue. Thank you.